right, we're on the air. Welcome to Science Sunday, and we welcome and we thank the DuPage UU Church for providing us this space, and for Steve Cooper up in the AV loft up there as we continue with science discussions through this time of isolation. I wanted to start with a reading I picked up from the science writer Maria Popova. You can find her online, and she's a very, very well-written and well-spoken person. Standing on the Shoulders of Solitude. Isaac Newton, the plague, and how quarantine fomented the greatest leap in science. In the 1650s, 370 years past, the penumbra of plague slowly began eclipsing Europe. Italy fell first, soon Spain, then Germany, then Holland. From across the slender cell wall of the Channel, England watched and trembled, then cautiously relaxed. For about a decade, some divine will seemed to be shielding the country. But the world was already worshiping at the altar of commerce, and the forces of globalization had already been set into motion. With England's economy relying heavily on trade, its ports bustled with ships carrying silk and tea and sugar from all discovered frontiers of the globe. Rats boarded the ships, fleas boarded the rats, bacteria, an almost kingdom of unicellular organisms yet to be coronated, for the cell itself was yet to be discovered, boarded the fleas which took to human flesh as soon as they debarked. And so, on Christmas Day, 1664, a single plague death was reported in London. Another came in February, then another. Great fears of sickness here in the city, the legendary diarist Samuel Pepys was writing by April. God preserve us all. God was no match for the absence of a basic scientific understanding of biology and epidemiology. The deaths were swift, gruesome, and soon so voluminous that services ceased being held. Over the course of the summer, the death toll swelled tenfold, from hundreds to thousands per week. The infected were ordered not to leave their homes. Many were boarded in and left to die in isolation. An enormous cross painted on the outside of each plagued house. Plays, spectator blood sports, and other crowd gatherings were banned. Street vendors were banned from selling their wares. Newsboys ceased crying and retreated indoors. An awful alien silence came to blanket this capital of din. The universities closed. When Cambridge, shown here, sent its students home, a young man obsessed with mathematics, motion, and light, whose illiterate father had died 3 months before his birth, who worshipped a God of order and not of confusion, and who had begun his university studies by performing servant's work for wealthier students in exchange for tuition, bundled his prized books and headed back to his mother's farm. There, Woolsthorpe Manor, in solitude and isolation as the plague continued its deadly sweep, Isaac Newton, December 25th, 1642 to March 19th, 1727, dreamt up the fulcrum that would dislodge humanity from the Dark Ages. There the apple, real or apocryphal, fell, and in its shadow rose the revolutionary idea of gravity, which the young man envisioned as a force, quote, extending to the orb of the moon, all the way from the earth, without cutoff or boundary. It was there, too, that he set out to compute that force, quote, requisite to keep the moon in her orb with the force of gravity at the surface of the earth, unquote. In the act of computing it, as a necessity of that act, he also invented calculus. In his excellent book, Isaac Newton, a gold standard of biography and of storytelling, bridging the scientific with the poetic, which also gave us the story behind the famous standing on the shoulders of giants metaphor. James Glick writes of the young Newton's plague-driven return home. Quote, "He built bookshelves and made a small study for himself. He opened the nearly blank 1,000-page commonplace book he had inherited from his stepfather and named it his waste book. He began filling it with reading notes. These mutated seamlessly into original research. He set himself problems, considered them obsessively, calculated answers, and asked new questions. He pushed past the frontier of knowledge, though he did not know this. The plague year was his transformation. Solitary and almost incommunicado, he became the world's paramount mathematician." From the fortunate platform of a long life, he lived to 84, more than double the era's life expectancy. His casket shouldered by dukes and earls, Newton would look back on his most intellectually fertile period of the plague years with the recognition that truth is the offspring of silence and meditation. In preparation for today's Science Sunday, I want to look at some thoughts and concerns as we are facing, as a community, this coronavirus outbreak. I broke into two areas. The first was that short celebration of one scientific savant facing a similar situation in the late 1600s. And the second is a longer look at how individuals living in societies in the past have dealt with challenges, restrictions, and curtailment of their liberties, such as we face now, and what that may mean to the human spirit. I hasten to add that you may not choose to look at this time as a curtailment of your liberties. It is also valid to call it a common attempt to free us from being crushed under the weight of huge COVID-19 numbers. As another example, sensible gun laws can be seen as a means to increase our freedom to go to work or school safely. So it's a bit in the perception of how you decide to look at what's going on right now. As the Enlightenment spread through Europe in the 1600s and 1700s, those in power sensed an immense threat. The great ideas of the Enlightenment challenged not only religious control of the populace, but also political powers and potentates. Excuse me. The challenge to the absolute control of every aspect of people's lives was serious. The accepted order that priests and kings knew all, and that their explanations of absolute power and absolute knowledge came only from God, were being put to the test. The reaction was quick and the reaction was strong. Numerous freethinkers, philosophers, and questioners of the status quo were dealt with firmly. Those who were not killed, tortured, or imprisoned were threatened with those possibilities, and therefore possibly cowed into silence or acquiescence. In a sense, the society shut down. Dissent was dealt with harshly. I've talked before of the persecution of Michael Servetus, the Spanish physician, writer, and polymath. Galileo, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci all subsumed their immense talents so as to survive in a society that honored acceptance of the status quo. My point is that the attack on free thought as Enlightenment ideas were introduced had to have delayed the advancement of scientific thought and the aims of the Enlightenment to a significant extent. I celebrate those living in those times that struggled against such crushing edicts. In Charles Darwin's 4th edition of The Origin of Species, he took the time to introduce a few dozen thinkers before him, who he acknowledged as his predecessors, those who gave him the foundation and support to follow his passion and continue to flesh out his important theory of evolution through natural selection. I mean to introduce some of them to you today as examples of how we may choose to act in a time that stifles us physically, emotionally, and sometimes spiritually. In 1692, French foreign interests sent Benoit de Maillet as consul to Cairo in Egypt. Cairo in Egypt, to protect the rights and regulate the 45 or so French traders that resided in what had once been a great capital, but was now little more than a provincial trading post of the Ottoman Empire. For 17 years, he collected geological observations about rocks, strata, sedimentation, and fossils, facts about sea levels, ideas about species. It was an incredible place to learn about the origin of the earth and its many varieties of plants and animals. Signs of prehistoric times were all around him. This is a picture showing what the Ottoman Empire in Egypt looked like at that time, 1648, when Benoit de Maillet was there. Signs of prehistoric time were all around him, in the pyramids, in their strange hieroglyphics, in the shifting sands and coastlines, and even the delta of the Nile. He read Herodotus's History of Egypt, written in the 5th century, excitedly. Herodotus described iron rings he had found in Memphis. If you can see on the map, Memphis is just below Cairo, about 25 miles. Just above the sign that says Lower Egypt, you can see Memphis there. And Herodotus lived in Memphis for a while and found iron rings that were set into rock, rings that had been used to moor ships hundreds of years before in the 7th century BC. Astonishingly, by the 5th century BC, when Herodotus stood contemplating these vestiges of an ancient harbor, there was no sea to be seen from even the highest roof terraces of Memphis. Maillet traveled to the site of Memphis, at that time only a looted ruin, a pile of rocks in the desert, and was disappointed that there was so little of this great city left. He was, he noted, elated to find the ruins and those iron rings that Herodotus had touched 2,100 years earlier, and also the scatterings of seashells amongst the boulders on the dry plain. Now that Maillet had reached that far back in time, there was no stopping his curiosity. So the reason that there were no harbors in Memphis anymore was the Nile Delta had filled in for hundreds of miles, or for 50 miles or so, past and out to where it is nowadays in Alexandria and the Rosetta, town of Rosetta that you can see on the top of the map. All those areas had filled in those hundreds of years, and Maillet had seen the records of what Herodotus wrote and saw how these things changed. So this led him to speculation. The Nile Valley shared evidence with de Maillet of immense tracts of time, not a commonly accepted thought at that time. These are the days of Bishop Ussher and the beginning of the world at 6,000 years ago. His insatiable spirit caused him to collect more and more ideas and facts and suppositions. His main contention was that the earth originally had been completely covered by water, and life developed as water receded first from the mountaintops and proceeded to the current state. This would explain the ideas that vexed Leonardo da Vinci and many people as to why there are fossils and seashells at the top of the highest mountains in Italy and around the world. His calculations, based on the rate of recedence since the time of Herodotus, came to an age of the earth of 2.4 billion years. De Maillet's collections of evidence and his writings would be considered dangerous and subversive by representatives of the church and the king if he expressed them. In an effort to conceal his subversive thoughts, de Maillet conceived of an Indian philosopher who could more safely express his ideas. He gave him a coded name. The red didn't come out well. I was trying to emphasize it on the screen, but you can see de Maillet wrote, and he gave a coded name to his Indian philosopher, and he gave him Taliamed. Or the subtitle of his book became Conversations between an Indian philosopher and a French missionary on the diminution of the sea, the formation of the earth, and the origin of man and animals. This is 100 years before Darwin's publication of The Origin of the Species. And he's making claims. So if you look, there is a code in there that maybe you can see when you look at Maillet and de Maillet. But I'll let you try to figure that out for yourself because I like scientific thought going on while I'm talking. In this writing, an imaginary French missionary narrator explains to the reader that a wise sage appeared suddenly in Cairo and announced that he was ready to pass on his secret discovery. Over several days, Maillet had expounded a theory of the earth based on 100 years of geological investigations, seabed mapping, diving, and fieldwork begun by his own grandfather and continued by his family on a remote peninsula on the coast of India. Of course, de Maillet was at once the wise Indian philosopher, Maillet, and the awestruck French missionary, as well as the ancient sage, Aiel, Maillet's grandfather. It was Maillet, not the council, who claimed that the earth was billions of years old, that it was shaped only by chance, and that all animals, including humans, had been transmuted from primitive sea creatures. If the Council of Cairo had been asked, he would have said that it was Maillet, not Maillet, who was the heretic. Maillet was extremely conscious that with Maillet, his book, he was on very dangerous ground. His explanations were deeply unchristian. They did not attempt to square their conclusions with the Bible or find a way to try to bring God into this picture. Maillet claimed that everything on the earth had been made through the operation of le hasard, French chance. Similarly to today, plague forced de Maillet to return to Paris in 1720. He was determined to find a publisher for his work, but that turned into a massive task. Such a heretical book demanded a powerful sponsor, a patron, and honestly, the random collected thoughts of a self-taught natural philosopher demanded extensive editing. He would spend the rest of his life trying to collate his thoughts while adding more, much more to the mix. He worked with a talented but overworked priest that had his own agenda, and that meshed poorly with Maillet's thoughts. While doing this, they both were avoiding the oversight of a senior police agent, Joseph d'Amoret, kind of the Javert in this story if you're a Les Miserables fan, who had them both under surveillance. D'Amoret was the inspector of books, looking for heretical, subversive writing. Given great powers to harshly interview, question, incarcerate, and more, he was tasked with keeping the lid on anti-Catholic and anti-royal efforts among Parisian intelligentsia. This was a time of the famous salons in Paris, which were constantly being infiltrated by agents of d'Amoret. Denis Diderot, editing his famous encyclopedia, was caught in the net and spent over 3 months under interrogation. Maillet, and here's a copy of the book, you can say it says Tome Premier, the first edition. Maillet was not published until 1748 in Holland, but selections from the manuscript were distributed and became the topic at many salons for more than 15 years prior to that. Maillet and his editor realized that they could never get the contents past the Paris book censors, even though it had been highly sanitized. Nevertheless, Maillet provoked a scandal. Outraged reviewers wrote angry, mocking repudiations in scientific journals and newspapers. In 1757, 9 years after publication, a still outraged naturalist with religious leanings wrote, "What a folly in this author to substitute Maillet for Moses, to bring man out of the depths of the sea, and for fear that he should descend from Adam to give us marine monsters for ancestors. Only a kind of godlessness could invent such a dream." 20 years later, it had become one of the best-selling books of the century. Benoit de Maillet was, by that time, long dead, never seeing his book in print. He had died in 1738, still tinkering with his manuscript and cajoling his editor to complete his work. Some of the really interesting parts of de Maillet's work were that he looked at this subsidence factor and he calculated a distance that the Earth tended to reduce, the levels of the sea reduced over time. And so his calculations were based on simple mathematics of if it reduced so much between Herodotus's time and his time, he could calculate to the top of the highest mountain and see when it had to have covered, when the sea had to cover the whole Earth. That was one of his fantastic stories, and then he spent a lot of time developing the proofs of this, and one was to investigate stories that he heard from sailors and different people that came to the ports of Alexandria and so on when he was there, and I think they found that they could probably get a nice meal and a place to sleep if they told him a good story, and he was collecting stories about mermaids and mermen and all the different people. He loved to find stories about humans that maybe still had remnants of a tail, which are somewhat of a possibility from a rare group of people nowadays even, as an ecological evolutionary descendant that didn't occur. But he loved these stories, and all these stories he found, and Taliamed told all these stories for hundreds of pages in this book about how this proved, and there were still creatures out there in the sea that were still based on still remnants of the people that had become what we were on land now. He spent a lot of time talking about how fish, and he saw flying fish that could break the surface of the water and cruise through the air for short distances. So he saw the possibility of fish turning into birds, and so it was wrong thought, not evolutionarily or scientifically accurate, but it was an attempt to explain, hypothesize, and develop what were possibilities at that time. Even his Age of the Earth was much more accurate than anyone else's at the time, but it was based on faulty logic as well too. So he's an interesting person, and he was definitely the talk of the town in Paris when his writings came around, and he helped foster a lot of other people's thoughts about these things as well too. Joseph d'Amaret and his agents had their eyes on hundreds of subversives at that time, as you can imagine. Under special surveillance was an exceptionally bright young man with flowing hair and piercing dark eyes. Denis Diderot grew up in a conservative town, Langres, if I can say that properly, less than 200 miles southeast of Paris, under the stifling control of his father and an overbearing older brother who was training for the priesthood. It sounds like my early days. In 1730, at 16 years of age, he broke away and moved to Paris. Paris, with its free thinkers, libraries and cafes, its philosophical and metaphysical conversations, was an eye-opening place for him. He worked as a tutor, giving mathematics lessons to private students. With the little that he earned, he put together a substantial library, attended lectures in the theater when he could afford it, read voraciously, and wrote and conversed freely. He even wrote the occasional sermon for money. Time passed, and he married and started a family. An interesting story about Diderot's library that he collected through hard bargaining with small booksellers in the town of Paris is that when he was working on his later works, it was very hard to get any money, but he was much appreciated for his thought, but it didn't pay well. And Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, knew of him and actually offered to buy his library from him and gave him a good amount of money for his library. And then she asked him to stay on and keep his library at his place and be the librarian for him as well too. So she was basically his patron in supporting his writing and his thoughts and giving him the money he needed to go on with his writing. His hunger for science and his intellectual curiosity led him to the salons of Paris, where he met and thrived in discussion with other intellects of the time. One of the amazing topics of the mid-1740s was a discussion of Trombly's Polyps, which topic I discussed in a past Science Sunday a few years ago. These were found in a pond by a tutor of two young boys head of the government in Holland, and they started doing simple experiments with them that quickly took off. These simple pond creatures could regenerate, they could split in half, they could grow multiple heads, they could swallow other polyps and perform other amazing feats, and it generated intense philosophical debate in the salons across Europe. Trombly was busy sending little bottles of water with these polyps in it all around the world, all around Europe, for the salons to experiment with and try out things. You can ask yourself, why are polyps so important and so interesting, and what did the creatures, these are now called hydra, small little pond creatures, what's the importance of that? Well, in the days of imperial kings, the questions started being asked, why could such simple creatures do things that humans could not? Why would God give such diminutive creatures capabilities that were not bestowed on humanity? Does this mean that God prefers them in some way? Do they possess a soul? All sorts of things came to even the point of questioning whether the presence of polyps and their capabilities, did that mean that actually kings and leaders shouldn't exist? So Diderot's scientific curiosity took a decided philosophical and political bent. His questions multiplied, many-headed, like the polyp itself. Diderot hatched a plan to create an encyclopedia, an attempt to bring knowledge directly to the people, bypassing priests and power brokers. The light, the new knowledge, was not in the pulpit, he declared to all who would listen. The answers were in the shaft of a microscope, in experimentation, in what you could touch, in the branches of knowledge. He read many books, including Enlightenment with de Maillet's description of ancient times and people evolving from sea creatures, and this provoked even more questions. His writings, although anonymous, provoked the careful Joseph d'Amoret. On July 31st, 1749, d'Amoret and his superior, the lieutenant general of the police, interrogated Diderot, who refused to admit anything, and declared under oath that he had not written any of the heretical books that had been attributed to him. The police threatened him, harassed his wife and children, questioned his friends, pulled in his publisher, and pressured him however they could. After weeks of sleepless nights, threats, anxiety, and nightmares, Diderot confessed to everything. He remained imprisoned for almost 4 months. When released, Diderot was a celebrity, though, not only in Paris, but all over Europe. The books that the police had worked so hard to ban were sold out. The time that he had spent in confinement had afforded him the opportunity to broaden his knowledge of the natural sciences and added immeasurably to the breadth of his entries as he restarted his work on his Encyclopédie. He met new and important friends who worked with him on his task and provided him a measure of protection from the police. One such man was Paul Thiry, Baron d'Holbach, a patron, fellow philosopher, scientist, translator, polymath, and a political protector. For the next 25 years, these two and others worked to produce numerous volumes of Encyclopédie and an amazing array of clandestine, heretical, and materialistic tomes that carefully explored and expanded humanistic thought, while, like Maillet, employing rhetorical strategies, using questions and making radical propositions before veering away from them or even refuting them, leaving their color and texture and brilliance still hanging in midair. Let me quote a page from Diderot. "May it not be," he wrote, "that just as an individual organism in the animal or vegetable kingdom comes into being, grows, reaches maturity, perishes, and disappears from view, so may whole species pass through similar stages? If the faith had not taught us that the animals came from the hands of the Creator just as they are now, and if it were permissible to have the least uncertainty about their beginning and their end, might not the philosopher, left to his own conjectures, suspect that the animal world has from eternity had its separate elements confusedly scattered through the mass of matter, that it finally came about that these elements united, simply because it was possible for them to unite. That millions of years have elapsed between each of these developments. That there are perhaps still new developments to take place which are as yet unknown to us. And that man will finally disappear from nature forever. Or, rather, will continue to exist, but in a form and with faculties wholly unlike those which characterize him in this moment of time. But religion spares us many wanderings and much labor. If it had not been enlightened on us on the origin of the world and the universal system of beings, how many different hypotheses would we not have been tempted to take for nature's sake? You can see him being very coy, jumping back and forth and making grand, spectacular statements and then backing off with them and saying, of course, we don't have to worry about that because religion tells us exactly how to think. May it not be, he wrote, if the faith had not taught us otherwise, he says. Imagine poor Joseph d'Amaret in his office trying to write a report defining the actual heresies committed by this man. He would pull his hair out. Denis Diderot died in 1784, 5 years prior to the French Revolution that disposed of the power elite that had worked so assiduously to constrain his talents. The Mercure, a literary journal of the time, wrote that his funeral rites were of a splendor rarely accorded to power, opulence, dignity. A numerous gathering of distinguished people, academicians, and men of letters accompanied the funeral procession. Such was the influence of his name that 20,000 spectators waited in this sad procession, in the streets, in the windows, and almost on the rooftops, with the curiosity that people reserve for princes. Baron d'Holbach, his Paris mentor, died in January 1789, 5 years later, and was buried alongside Diderot in the same crypt at the Church of St. Roch, blocks from the Salon, both of them made famous. 4 months later, the first wave of the French Revolution began with the convocation of the Estates Generales. In July, thousands stormed the Bastille. In August, the new assembly published the Declarations of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Only 10 months after d'Holbach had been buried, the assembly declared that the property of the church was at the disposal of the nation. The house on the Rue Royale, the most important center of Enlightenment Paris, the home of the salon of Diderot and Baron d'Holbach, is now occupied by a dental surgeon and a software company who have never heard of the Baron d'Holbach or his salon. Diderot asked once, "Who knows what breeds of animals will succeed ours? Everything changes, everything passes, only the whole remains." 74 years after Diderot's death and 122 years after Maillet's death, in February 1860, Charles Darwin added the name of Benoit de Maillet to his list of 19 predecessors in evolutionary thought and posted that list to the botanist Asa Gray in New York, asking him to include it in the first authorized American edition of On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. Darwin did that on a recommendation of a friend, not having read the book, but he was sent a copy in 1867. When he did this, immediately detractors, famous one is Richard Owen, another scientist I've talked about in Science Sunday, immediately took issue with Darwin's theories of evolution and wanted to critique him and wondered how if Darwin was as crazy as de Maillet, who had talked about mermaids and mermen coming off onto the earth and making the world, populating the world with humans from that. And that had pretty much embarrassed Darwin because he was kind of told that he had crackpot ideas as well. And so he hid his copy of of de Maillet's book, he was sent a copy in 1867, and he hid it upstairs in the attic of Down House. In 1993, only 27 years ago, that 1750 edition of Untitled was found again deep in a box stored in the family attic at Down House. In Maillet's yellowed pages, Darwin had placed a single line in the margin to mark passages of special interest to him. Passages on fish transforming into birds, ape-human breeding, mermaid and mermen, and finally, Untilted's statement that he was absolutely sure that all species must have come into being through adaptation and transmigration without any divine intervention. Diderot and Maillet navigated the best that they could the challenging politics of their time. 50 years before the French Revolution was a very conservative, a very restrictive time in European history. As we have seen, the slightest detour from the orthodoxy of the day would consign the transgressor to arrest, punishment, or worse. What amazes me about the times is the compulsion that led these free thinkers to follow their thoughts and share their knowledge with a hungry world. Priests and bishops denounced Darwin's predecessors. Police agents spied on them. Free thinkers locked their ideas away for fear of bringing disgrace or worse on their families. As authors, they deferred publishing, but also they searched out like-minded men and women in safe places to ask, share, and discuss the questions about the origins of time and of species that pressed on them. They went underground. They went on gathering evidence just the same, convinced that species were not fixed and that they had not all been created in 7 days. Religious leaders, politicians, and even university leaders called them infidels. They believed them to be as dangerous as the Muslim soldiers during the Crusades. Anyone who promoted a theory about the mutability of species, they declared, was an enemy of Christianity because such an idea contravened the sacred truths set out in the Bible. What I believe they are pathfinders, iconoclasts, and innovators. Their determined, lifelong study is an inspiration to us all in the times we live in. We can study and think and share our insight with others and not allow ourselves to be constrained to fit in and mimic the prevailing thoughts of society. Our times really are much freer than the times of Diderot and de Maillet. May we use our brains and look for the truths we can find in this world, and then, best of all, share them with each other. Hey, did you decipher the code of de Maillet? How did he claim the authorship of Untitled without putting his name on the manuscript? Did anyone come in with any thoughts about that, Scott?
Let me look at the email.
Scott hasn't been looking at the email.
I've been paying attention.
He's been entranced, haven't you? Any questions or thoughts? Send them in to Scott. I think it's what, T. Scott?
T.Scott65 at humanistchat.org.
T.Scott65 at humanistchat.org. T.Scott65 at humanistchat.org.
Or just T.Scott. T.Scott works as well. You don't have to do this.
You don't have to do the 65. T.Scott at humanistchat.org. Okay? So if you look at what's going on here, de Maillet needed to come up with a character name for his Indian philosopher. And if you look at it, start looking from the right and reading back to the left, as people did with hieroglyphics at the time, and as the Egyptian and Coptic scholars, I believe, did. And if you look at it, he actually wrote Untitled backwards as Deimaiillet. De Maillet. Untitled is de Maillet backwards. So I know I left that hanging for my son to try to decipher, and he did actually, looking at it for quite a while, but he needed it in front of him, and I know I didn't have it in front of you for much time or give you much chance to look at that as well too. Scott, I don't know, do you have any questions or thoughts? Or you?
Yeah. I don't know if the mic's
The mic is over here and ready for you.
on.
Put you on the spot.
Yeah. Sorry, I was a couple minutes late. The landscaper showed up at my door right as I was getting ready to leave.
Well, that's essential.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's social distancing. He's working in the backyard and I'm here.
Yeah.
So, no, I thought this was really excellent. Like, I didn't know about de Maillet at all. And, you know, one of the things that strikes me is the narrow interval between when thoughts were oppressed and thinkers, free thinkers especially, were physically imperiled, and just a couple decades later where free thought was more accepted. You know, I don't know if the American Revolution had anything to do with that. I know a lot of the Enlightenment era thinkers inspired some of our founding fathers here for the United States. But what are your thoughts about the seemingly rapid progress of unshackling free thought in that era?
Well, I think time is a relative issue when you start thinking about that, and I imagine it didn't feel very quick-paced to the people of the time.
Yeah, right.
I imagine the 4 months that Diderot was in custody didn't pass as pleasantly as he would have wished them to do. He was getting, from what I read, complaining letters from his family. He had a young son who was actually very sick at the time, and the wife was distraught, trying to. The money had come away. There was no money coming in,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, so there was some challenges at that time. You think Diderot actually lived his whole life, and he lived a pretty long life, but it didn't come to fruition until 5 years after his death.
Like de Maillet, right? It was also.
Well, yeah, de Maillet died in 1738, and the French Revolution was in the 1789.
Wasn't so? If I remember correctly, I think also Copernicus. Some of his most important works were published posthumously.
Mm-hmm.
So that seemed to be kind of a recipe for notoriety. I don't know if success is the right word or not, but
Death helped a lot of these people become successful.
yeah. So let that be a lesson to all of us.
Well, there was a famous biologist at the time, worked much more in tune with the political tenor of the time, Comte de Buffon.
Yeah.
And he worked at the Royal Gardens, and he put out books. He taught classes and so on. And every time he got to a certain level of points making, you know, his science took him to a certain level, and he then would be castigated. He'd be brought before inquisitors. And 2 different times he just admitted, he said, yep, I'm going to say those 14 different sentences that you found objectionable in what I wrote. I'm going to take them out. I'm not going to say them, and they won't be in the next edition, and so on. And then he went on and published them anyways in the next edition. So
Yeah.
they played games.
Sorry.
I forgot. I'll do it out of the next one.
Yeah.
And actually he got more and more radical as he aged. So that's a good thing for
Yeah.
us to think about.
Well, it seems to be happening to you. I don't know about me.
But yeah, he finally he wrote some things about how he was walking. I don't have the quote exactly in mind, but how he was walking into society, he was walking out into the world as a masked man. So he had to keep this mask on to keep his position and do things. But,
Figuratively speaking, not a
yeah.
COVID mask, right?
right.
Yeah.
I can walk out into the world as a masked man as well too, I'm thinking.
Right. Yeah.
But anyways, yeah, so, I mean, some of these things as a scientist, you are very interested in the truth, and it pains you not to be able to bring it out, right?
Well, I think one of the things that really intrigues me is the struggles that Charles Darwin went through with regard to bucking convention. You know, in some sense, Darwin at least, I'm not well versed at all about Diderot and de Maillet and some of the other Enlightenment luminaries, but I know from reading biographies of Darwin that he was just absolutely sickened, literally sickened,
yeah.
by the thoughts he was having and the implications and the evidence leading him away from traditional religious interpretations of the way the universe and life came into being. And
He
it was
He was a bit of a
hard person.
hypochondriac, and he took the wet cure many times that were kind of questionable means of shocking the body back into normal activity. But and he was definitely very concerned about. His wife was devout, and he was
Right.
concerned about the impact that it had on her, and held off on publishing for quite a while. He had basically his theories, like de Maillet kept his theories for, 35 years before
Right.
they were,
Well, it was Wallace Publishing that spurred Darwin into action after
or Wallace's letter to
Right.
Darwin asking
Yeah,
him
thank
to
you.
help him publish, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The evidence could have been much different. And one of the things that impresses me, and I write about it a little bit in my first pending book, is the notion that the evidence could have bolstered one or more of the myths we tell about the origin of species and whatnot. It would have been very plausible to have had a world where the evidence of miraculous speciation and short time spans and whatnot was obvious for everyone. In fact, many of the people who went looking for this evidence expected to find it. And when they didn't, people like Darwin were stymied, and it caused great, if you will, soul searching.
Yeah. There's an interesting story about Lord Kelvin, who
Right.
was the most well-known, famous, William Thomson was his name, and he was given the title Lord Kelvin based on a lot of his amazing scientific research.
It was his secret science identity,
Yeah.
Lord Kelvin. Oh, I'm William Thomson during the day, but
Right.
at night I'm
Right.
Lord Kelvin.
He had a little cave that he had
Yeah, right.
capes up and stuff. But he actually was the most renowned scientist of the time, and he was asked to find proofs, and the big thing that stopped evolutionists from their proof was, how do you prove that the earth is as old as it needs to be for evolution to take place? And Kelvin was a big stop to that, because he looked at the temperature. Obviously, Lord Kelvin was a big thing with him, and he was looking at the slow reduction in time, similar to how Maillet was looking to the slow subsidence of the water levels
Right.
of the earth. He was looking at the slow temperature gradient dropping in time, and he was doing scientific estimates based upon the heat of the earth now, and how quickly it would lose its temperature, and what its mass was, and so on.
He did something similar for the sun, I think.
Yes, he had done that prior to that too, and then so people asked him to look at the earth. And actually, it's one of the biggest scientific blunders at times, because what he didn't do was incorporate the possibility that there was another source that was causing
Yeah.
the heat in the earth that could make the time expand on it.
I
and
don't know.
that's-
He was such an idiot. He didn't even try to research nuclear energy.
He didn't have
right.
nuclear energy in his wheelhouse.
Yeah.
So, but without the fact of heat generated in the earth from nuclear energy, there's a lot of issues about the time frame that was the one
Cooling of
data
it,
point,
yeah.
the cooling of the earth, that couldn't be explained, that why the earth would still have the levels of thermal activity that
Right.
it does now.
We did get a question
Ah.
and a comment that it was a great salon. This is a kind of a salon, a virtual salon for Science Sunday, from Randy Skenkat, Schenkkat.
Okay.
And Randy has a question. What is your sense of the impact on the broader population, percentage-wise, of free thinking? How was it represented in the media of the day, I guess, during that era?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, I would say that salons became very popular. They were spread across all of Europe. From Russia, Catherine the Great had a salon, and they were all over Europe. And it seems to me like it was a occurrence among the intelligentsia.
Wasn't it also, if that was contemporaneous essentially with the period of the American Revolution, which I'm more familiar with the history of, there were a lot of pamphleteers. You know, nearly anybody could write a pamphlet, and back then, I guess that was before YouTube, and
Few years.
to be entertained or enlightened, as it were, people would read, and there were all kinds of publishers and pamphleteers, and newspapers. So I suspect that there was quite a print hubbub about some of these ideas.
Yeah, I know that certain things just took on this wave of importance. Trombly's polyps were this phenomenal,
Wow.
when I first read about them, it was just phenomenal to hear how these little pond creatures, which are still in ponds, you can find them around here, what impact that had on people's thought and philosophy. It's
Challenging the divine right of kings with a little pond critter.
Right, yeah, yeah. So I would say that maybe like today too, there's a lot of people that didn't be impacted by that.
Mm-hmm.
I would be hard pressed to give a percentage and so on, but I can't imagine a farmer, hunting for mushrooms in the
French countryside.
outside of France. But the impact it had on many people was great. You think of Diderot growing up in this small town, and then coming to Paris and being enlightened, literally by the Enlightenment. You can imagine and appreciate the impact. It's hard to measure it, but it changed the world. It made revolutions possible. It changed heads of state.
Throwing off the monarchy and
Right,
whatnot. Even
right.
the idea of monarchy.
Right.
One of the things that I noticed when you had this slide up of de Maillet was that his book, it looked like the first edition was published in Amsterdam,
Right.
not
Right.
in France.
Right.
So my sense historically is that the Netherlands, Amsterdam, etc., were more of a hotbed or more accommodating to free thinkers and radical ideas back then. I mean, again, American history, one of my subjects I'm passionate about. I think the Pilgrims were a radical religious sect, and they found freedom
Acceptance.
and acceptance in the Netherlands. So, you have religious extremists and free thinker extremists that find a welcoming intellectual and political space in a country that believed that all ideas had merit and should be talked about in the marketplace of thought.
Which I think is what America has always felt like it was and should be, and what we feel like it should be as well too. Not this conformity of belief, but this acceptance of a wide range of things. And you can talk about anything in that regard. I think I started out my talk talking about you may decide to look at this time as a time that's somewhat curtailing our liberties. And that's not an invalid point. I think that's very true. People are feeling confined and left to their own devices without a lot of support. But it's also valid and important to also realize that it's an attempt at freeing us too from this terrible COVID-19 disease
Right.
we have. So, you have to look at it in both ways. Is it the best way? I wish that there were this great scientific answer to say exactly what we should do. I'm so interested in what's been going on in Sweden. And what it seems to me is that people nowadays are saying that what's happened in Sweden with this relaxing or never the implementation of the quarantine and so on, but trying to emphasize to people, take care, be wise, don't go out, open your store if you want. What's the impact of that? And it seems like people on both sides, from what I've seen, are using it to support their already preconceived ideas, which I think is one of the biggest problems we have as country and as a group of people right now, we should look at Sweden carefully and try to understand what is going on. And it may take us a few years to understand it. It could be that they do have a higher death rate in Sweden than they do in the other Scandinavian countries around it, but it also may be that that's the price that they paid to get a herd immunity, some level of capacity to resist this disease. And you have to say that they haven't had the stringent controls over their lives, and they haven't been so economically challenged as other places have been too.
You know, one of the things that this highlights, just your explanation of it makes me think about, is the constant tug of war in our social discourse, our political discourse, our philosophical discourse between the rights of individuals and the well-being of groups.
Yeah.
You know, there's this strain of thinking that's very ancient that individual liberty is the thing of paramount importance at all times. And there's another strain of thinking that says that, you know, the sort of the greatest good for the greatest number. And finding the right balance there is a matter of choice, and it's a matter of political will and a matter of persuasion. There is, you know, natural science can't tell us a definitive answer about what's better. Natural science just tells us what's possible, what likely outcomes may happen. If everybody runs rampant and has physical freedom, then the disease will likely progress faster. But during this time when we have perhaps physical constraints, we still have our freedom of speech and our mental freedom of inquiry, and that's tying into what you were talking about with people who let their minds roam across the universe or the planet in times when they might have otherwise been physically constrained.
Right, I like that point a lot. I think that you're as constrained as you decide to be, and part of my point of talking today was trying to encourage people to get out there and be unconstrained in the ways that you can be unconstrained. You may constrain yourself, you may be asked to constrain yourself to try to stop this short cycle, which is seeming like it's a lot longer than we want it to be. Remember, Diderot was in prison for 4 months, and you know, I can't say how we should act or what we should do. I do tend to think that natural science can give us some answers that tell us that this is better than that. And you need to look at what's going on, how many deaths will occur, and I think looking at Sweden and looking at different things around there, I think science is an answer in a lot of those ways. Sometimes it's an answer after the horse is out of the barn door and everything's going on. But it may help us in the next one too. You wish that there'd been things done prior to this that would help us understand what it really means to be in a situation. And I think, again, science is the way that you help and understand that too.
Any deliberate actions we take in a physical world will have consequences. Some consequences will be negligible and benign. Other consequences might be significant for individuals or societies. But I think it is a very prominent role of science to talk about the potential consequences of our intended actions. And that's going to be the wrap up for my Quest series in a couple weeks. I want to talk about the choices that we face in paying attention to science versus, for example, mythology, and where those choices may lead us.
Yeah, we all have to make choices, and it's good to have good facts and good information that helps us make them better.
Well, thanks, Mike. This was really great.
Thanks. I appreciate it a lot, and everyone be safe out there. Take care of yourselves, and hope we get through this well. I know we have Science Sunday in 2 weeks with Scott, and we're still talking with the church as to what we want to do further if we're going to try to provide some way to keep meeting through the summer. I know it's nice, from my point of view at least, to take a break from the preparations for this once in a while, but it's also really nice to me to be with you and to share these thoughts and ideas and to hear your thoughts and responses back too. So thanks a lot, and very glad we can be here and enjoy. It's a beautiful May day, and Scott and I are probably going to socially distance and have a lunch together and sit on opposite sides of a table and on my deck in the backyard, and watch the fish swim in the pond. So enjoy your May, and everyone be safe.
Bye-bye.